Amy, thank you. Ladies and gents, good morning. What an entirely appropriate guest we have with us this morning. We have Air Marshal Cliff Spink during Battle of Britain week, and I think what we'll bring out over the next hour or so will be the absolute relevance of that. But Cliff, good morning. Can you hear me okay?
I can. Thanks very much, Del. Yes.
Lovely. How are you?
I'm pretty well, thank you, all things considered. Yes, I mean, I think I've never been fitter with all the gardening I've been doing, that's for sure.
Well, no excuse now, is there?
No, absolutely not. I'm absolutely right. Yes. So yeah, it's in good shape. Thanks. Missing a lot of things, which I'm sure all the audience and you are as well, particularly the aviating. But yeah, we'll have to wait and see how that moves.
Absolutely. We'll bring out clearly throughout the aviation side. You mentioned as we were chatting before we went live, you haven't flown for 10 months, and I'd be interested to see as we go through exactly how that's felt, having your feet firmly on the ground rather than being where perhaps you might prefer to be. But
yeah. I think my wife is probably best to answer that question. But anyway, you'll get the drift. I think Caged Lion comes to walk.
Yeah. Well, with a bit of luck, we'll be easing up as we go into next year. I think we've got some interesting months to come. But as I say, more of that as we go through. As everybody knows, Cliff, and as we spoke about before, this is all about you. So thank you very much for joining us. A really fitting guest during this Battle of Britain period and the 80th celebration. And I know we'll talk about your aviation career as we go through. But let's go right back to the beginning, if we may, and talk about your right back at the beginning. What motivated you to join the service, and talk us through how you joined, the schooling that went before it.
All right. Well, I'm a farmer's boy, so I grew up in the countryside in Kent. So I'm a man of Kent. So very much Air Force associated in that, and so a county steeped in stories about the Battle of Britain, not least from my father, who was actually in the army during the Second World War, but he only joined at the end of 1940. So when I was a young lad, I was going around the farm, sitting on his tractor or doing whatever, he would point out where this airplane came down and where this pilot came down. So I was sort of enmeshed in aviation, even when I was a shore tacker. I went to the local village school. I was moderately successful there, and we had a thing called the 11 plus, which I'm sure a lot of people remember, which I amazingly passed. I then went to Sheerness Technical High School, which was a long journey actually for someone who lived in the countryside south of Sittingbourne. I had to go all the way into Sittingbourne and then by steam train originally to Sheerness, so it was a long day. My secondary education was less successful, not so much as the academic side, but I think my relationship with most of the teachers was good, but we had a headmaster who was, I didn't get on with at all. And he was, I thought, a bit of a thug, but anyway, and I think my opinion, I've now found out from old cohorts that they felt the same. And so I've always had probably an over heightened sense of injustice. And particularly when I was younger, probably hence why I was a long-term junior officer, couldn't keep my mouth shut. But so eventually he and I fell out with another young lad who was in my form. And I was given it's either going to be you or me, and it's not going to be me type of interview with the headmaster. Luckily, in parallel with this, I joined the ATC because I'd always been interested in aeroplanes. And I was lucky to be taken under the wing of a great man called Dennis Jarrett, who was the CEO of the Sittingbourne ATC Squadron, now sadly died, a wartime Singler flying. And he was a great chap, and he had an excellent ATC squadron. It was really well run. He ultimately became headmaster of one of the big secondary schools in Sittingbourne. And thankfully, that was the thing that kept me on the rails, because at school, I was certainly heading off them. And as a consequence of being told it was you or me by the headmaster, luckily I got all the pegs in the right places to join the Royal Air Force, albeit I was only 16. And although I desperately wanted to fly, it was not to be at that age. So literally, it seemed to me a matter of weeks later, and my father, being a farmer, wouldn't have let me sit idle anyway. I was in the Royal Air Force as an apprentice. And that was the start, Dale.
So your choice to go into the apprenticeship, did you think anything about going into further education, or was it an absolute calling and passion from what Dennis had led you into, by the sounds of it, from the ATC perspective?
I think, yeah, I mean, one of the teachers, in fact, several of the teachers at my school, who saw that I was basically in a contest with the headmaster, were very kind and said, look, you need to go on to either a sixth form college or something like that. I'd taken some O-levels, I'd taken some O-levels early, so but frankly, I'd had a bellyful of education at that point, or as I thought. As you know, at 16, you know everything. And so I just wanted to get out into the world, frankly. And although being an engineer was not my first choice, it was into the Royal Air Force. And so I joined at Halton when I was 16. I wasn't far off 17, I must admit. On the, well, kind of hate to admit how long ago it was now, in terms of 8th of May 1963.
Wow.
Yeah, I joined with, in fact, I joined with a couple of others from my school, but I joined as an electrical apprentice air. Actually, even though it was a tough environment, Halton, we forget that in the 60s, you've got people coming in from all parts of the country, and I was a pretty naive and sheltered young man, even though I'd been in farming. Not a very big village, so a fairly limited group of friends, even though I'd obviously made friends at school. So when I got into Halton, the actual environment, when you were joining with boys who came from pretty tough backgrounds, all got to a suitable level, all really quite smart. We had some quite smart boys. That sounds disparaging, but we did have them. But they came from some pretty tough backgrounds. And so you had to adjust. And getting into the team was part of the RAF education. And I think, frankly, Halton was great. It was tough. I suddenly found education again. They had schools there, and I took a lot of O-levels, and I think I got an ordinary national certificate in electrical engineering, which amazed me. I enjoyed the school side. I quite enjoyed the engineering side, but there were some people there who perhaps weren't as good academically, but their skill with their hands was quite outstanding. And I wasn't what I would call I was okay, and I was obviously going to graduate and all that sort of thing, but there was some young men there whose skill with their hands and their understanding of the intricacies of engineering was quite amazing, and they were so good at taking a piece of metal and put it in the right shape, which probably took me about a week to try and do the same thing. But anyway, Halton was a wonderful re-education, I suppose you put it. I loved the environment, and I think they probably put me back on the rails, as the Air Force had wont to do. And of course, I hadn't left that burning fuse that I really wanted to fly.
Did you, just leaping significantly further forward, did you ever go back as a reviewing officer at Halton? And can you just ask, if I may, how how that felt going back, having been a Halton apprentice and then going back as the reviewing officer?
It was a very emotional day, actually. I can remember going back as an air marshal and standing on the saluting dais and looking out and looking at the very block I used to live in, however many decades it was ago, and seeing the young men and women and going and talking to them. And I was transported back many, many years for when I left as a sergeant apprentice. Luckily, yes, it was very emotional. And luckily, as I say, I graduated, and I will mention this. You graduated as a junior technician unless you hadn't passed your exam. And maybe very few only graduated as senior aircraftsmen, but most as junior tech. If you'd managed to do reasonably well, you graduated as a corporal. There was a handful, and I was lucky enough to graduate as a corporal. Not that I ever wore the exalted tabs of a corporal, but I do remember that I'd been selected, and I'll tell you the story about how I was told by the commandant that I was going flying training. But the Air Force system still works, churns its way, and even though I knew I was going on to pilot training, I still got a posting notice as a corporal to send me to Sealand on what they used to call crash and smash, where you used to go and pick up bits of old airplanes that had not flown or unsuccessfully had impacted the ground. So I was invited down by the commandant, who was a very famous and connect with Battle of Britain Week, a very famous Battle of Britain pilot called Al Deer. He was on his last tour in the Air Force as an Air Commodore, the New Zealander, and if you read his book Nine Lives, he bailed out of a lot of airplanes and shot down a lot of airplanes. But I always remember marching into his office on tenterhooks as to what my future was going to be. And I saluted, and he said, "Well, sit down, Spink." And I sat down, and he had a smile on his face. And he had a super sense of humor. And he looked at me, he said, "Look, I put you out of your misery, Spink." He said, "We think you're going to be a bloody awful engineer, so we're sending you pilot training." I'm sure he spoke for another 5 minutes or so, but of course, I can't remember a word he said because I was just already head in the clouds.
Lovely. So I can imagine the conversations later in your career with engineers revealing that, unless of course you've never revealed that fact before, that Al Deer felt that you wouldn't be a good engineer. So it's actually only by luck that you had this great aviation career.
I hope he was joking about the engineer, but I think I've probably been a moderate one. I think there've been a lot better engineers than me. And
of course, we'll never find out. So pilot training it was.
Yes.
What happened then after Halton?
Well, I went straight to Cranwell, and of course, having just done 3 years of not only the training but the spit and polish that goes with any training organisation, I was straight back at the bottom, doing the same thing again. You know, arranging your cupboards and your wardrobes and your bed packs and things like that. And I thought, oh my God, I've got another 3 years of this. But having done it, that was like falling off a log. And actually, it was great because the young people I was meeting, who were probably not too dissimilar age from me, having joined at 16, these were boys who hadn't had an argument with their headmaster, and had then graduated through A-levels and got to Cranwell. So we weren't too dissimilar. Maybe I was about 9 months older with some of the other ex-apprentices. So it was good that I was able to help them and integrate into another absolutely grand bunch of people. And of course, we did all the schooling. Things were changing. We didn't know it when we first joined, when I joined Cranwell in '66. But things were changing. The university scheme was coming in greater numbers. And in fact, during the course of what was to be a 3-year Cranwell education and flying training, it was reduced to 2.5. And I actually graduated in '68. So what Cranwell was the education side, the sciences, the military history, much which I loved. I'd actually got back into a schooling by that time, but of course it was the flying training on the Jet Provost that we were all looking forward to. Jet Provost, because although entries just preceding us had done first the Chipmunk on what we called the North Airfield at Cranwell, the grass airfield, and then went on to the Jet Provost. The feeling was that we were becoming more of a jet-oriented Air Force, so that we were going through all the way through on the Jet Provost. Subsequently, the Air Force decided to bring back in the Chipmunk because it was felt that there were too many people just getting through the system on the Jet Provost, which in pure flying terms was quite an easy airplane to fly. And we didn't have enough of a filter, which the Chipmunk had acted as, to weed out those people who maybe didn't have the motor skills. Anyway, I went through 170 hours of the most great time at Cranwell, great time. You know, how we survived the driving between Lincoln and the Teachers Training College was the most hazardous thing, but it was a wonderful flying training that I had. I had a great instructor, or we had several great instructors, and eventually we were sweating on where we were going, because we were generally streamed into what was to become known as fast jet, heavy airplanes or helicopters, and we were always biting our nails because I wanted to go on to fighters, as to whether or not I'd be on that. I think it was about 11 out of 40 or maybe 12 out of 40 who subsequently went on to fighters. So you were really working quite hard to make sure you were selected.
So a lovely couple of years, 2.5 years at Cranwell. I think we know that you got the jet. So what followed?
Well, then it was through what was. It wasn't as smoothly through. I might just say that just after I'd finished, I had about a month before I went to Valley on Nats. And I probably did the best thing I ever did in terms of flying, in getting a tick in the box, shall we say. But I thought I had my legs pulled so many times by the senior entries who told us we weren't real pilots because we hadn't flown the Chipmunk. I decided to try and get myself Chipmunk qualified in the month. And I went to Northumbrian University Air Squadron at RAF Euston, which is to the west of Newcastle, which is why I'm a lifelong Newcastle supporter. I don't even go there. But I went there for a month, and I got myself qualified on the Chipmunk. And that was to prove invaluable over the years, because any small gap I had, or on a ground tour or staff appointment or something, I could always go to the AEF and fly Chipmunks. And that meant that, luckily, in my service career, over the 40 years, I think the biggest gap in currency on an aeroplane was about 6 months. And I was flying an RAF airplane all the way through. So largely because of that. Anyway, I went to Valley. I enjoyed the Nat. I had a mad Irishman called John McWilliam as my instructor, who scared the pants off me most of the time. That was great. And we were then streamed. There was still some Canberra posts. The Harrier wasn't really quite yet in. It was just coming in, and so the Phantoms. I was selected for the Lightning. I wanted to go to Hunters, to be perfectly honest. I wanted to go out into the desert and things like that. But as it was to transpire, it was a wonderful. I was so glad I was selected for Lightnings. And after you'd finished, I think it was about 60 or 70 hours on the Nat, down to Chivenna, which again was quite outstanding. I just loved the hunter and combat and firing bullets at the flag and low-level navigation. It was just a young man's paradise. And of course, you know, we're always getting into trouble as well. I should have said that, you know, life seemed to revolve around being selected for extra orderly officers, and which all seemed to come in. I think one of the, I had a late lamented friend. I'll tell a story. I was with Scotty McLean, another of the students, and a chap called Al Martin, who sadly has died now, but he was a great old friend, was walking back from night flying. And we did something as stupid. We saw him coming back from night flying. We were going to the bar. We were amongst the huts there. And we just jumped out and just went, and he jumped out of his skin, and really jumped out of his skin. Anyway, we just laughed, and I was nothing more serious than that. At the weekend, I was lounging in the bar. The bath is an absolutely true story, and Al Martin determined he was going to get his own back. And the way the geography of the blocks were arranged, it had one of these little windows. They were thin-skinned, terribly cold in winter. But I had gone to sleep in the bath. And I woke up, I kid you not, apart from my knees and arms, and we won't talk about all the regions, but I woke up blue. And it wasn't blue from temperature. Al Martin had got a damn great vat of blue ink, and how he did it, he was so I was asleep, I managed to get it into my bath through a tube. Knew I was sleeping, and I literally was blue from and it took me about 5 or 6 days to get this bloody stuff off me.
So those were your Smurf years, were they?
Well, those my Smurf. I looked a bit like this. Anyway, hunters were great, were fantastic, and it was a great time. True to form, we were having a lot of gaps in our flying training, and I spent a lot of time before I got to Coltishall, which is where the Lightning OCU was, hanging around. But it was, luckily, I had this qualification of chipmunks. So I spent a lot of time at Bicester, flying the chipmunks, glider towing, the tiger moths, the osters, and also being a gliding instructor. I'd done a little bit of gliding before at Halton, and became a full category instructor in those few months we had in between courses. So that was great fun as well. You know, I never stopped. And then of course I got to the Mighty Lightning. Wow, that was a jump indeed.
Let's hear about the Lightning years then, because I'm sure that everybody watching either now or when they catch up on YouTube in due course will be fascinated to hear of your experiences flying the Mighty Lightning.
Well, I think the first impression you get, because we'd hung around for a little bit, I did have to go to Manby, which was up near Louth, to do a few hours jet refreshing, because we'd hung around so long from hunters. But that was great. And then we went from the jet provost to the Lightning, which is a mighty leap. But anyway, that's as it was. Yeah, I think walking across the hangar at Coltishall to look at the Lightning for the first time. I mean, I knew what the Lightning was and all the rest of it, but you suddenly realize this was a big aeroplane. Awesome to me, it was a mighty aeroplane. And I thought, wow, that is a chunky piece of kit. And it looked mean, and it looked imposing, and it looked purposeful. And sure it was. And I always remember that my instructor on the Lightning, the T5, you flew obviously some dual sorties before you went solo. And I was going through on the Mark 5s and the Mark 3s. I got in the first trip I ever had in the Lightning with Jimmy Jewell, my instructor, and it was a instructor's benefit. You didn't even fly in the left-hand seat, you flew in the right-hand seat, and he just took you up. And I didn't know whether it was to impress you or intimidate you. I think it was a bit of both, actually. This is what you're coming at. And I always remember Jim getting airborne with a reheat takeoff. And it was almost hard to describe the way, almost as if the earth is being pulled away from you. You're going up so fast, and it's breathtaking, almost lying on your back as this airplane is going skywards in almost rocket trajectory. And Jim looked across at me, and I'm wide-eyed and thinking, oh my God, I've got to fly this soon. And he looked across at me and he said, there you are, young man. He said, the only reason we've got wings on this airplane is to keep the nav lights apart.
And again, if I may, jumping right ahead, did anything in the future from an aviation perspective in sheer power compared to that first experience of being strapped into the Lightning?
I think time for time, no. I was lucky to fly a lot of different and varied NATO airplanes, and of course I went on to the Phantom, which we'll talk about in a minute, and the Tornado. But I think time for time, as a young man, and indeed pure performance, in terms of its operational capability, we might debate that, but the Lightning was a true rocket ship. It really was. The smaller, when I say the lighter weight Lightnings with the big engines, you could get to 36,000 feet in a heartbeat. And frequently, after I'd finished my course, I went on to Treble 1 Squadron at Wadisham. The normal air test for the Lightning was to 56,000 feet. That was only limited by the oxygen system that you had, which was only cleared to 56,000 feet, just in case you had an explosive decompression. And we went through all this sort of stuff at North Luffenham, where you put you in a decompression chamber and put you through hell and all that sort of stuff. And took oxygen masks off and waited to, couldn't add up 2 and 2, which was difficult even when I was on full oxygen. No, so the airplane was cleared to 56,000 feet, but the actual airframe would go much higher. And of course, being young men, we did. Now, I can't confess to going as high as some of the others, and you will have read from other Lightning pilots, they were up in the 70s. I think, truthfully, the most I ever made was the mid-60s. And what happened was you were going through 56,000 feet, and it was a technique where you did a high mark run, descending high mark run, and then at 1.3 Mach, you did a climb with full reheats. But as you got higher and higher, you gradually brought the reheats back because there was always a danger that they would pop out, a rich cut, literally. And there's always a worry that if that happened, it would put the engine out as well. So you brought the engines slowly back into cold power as you were going up. Because the last thing you wanted is the engines going out at that height. For obvious reasons, you'd lose pressurization. And as you went through 56, it was wonderful because you suddenly saw the curvature of the Earth, and the sky becomes a deep midnight blue. I mean, I'm sure Vulcan and PR9 pilots will attest to, they've all been flying up in that sort of area. And then because you couldn't just push to get the nose down because you didn't have the authority on the tailplane, you used to roll on your back and then just pull. And we frequently topped out in those high areas. But so the airplane, and indeed, if I can tell us short aside, that it was during this period, although unknown to us, or just probably a little earlier than I was on the Lightning, that one of the black programs was the Lightning intercepting U-2s. The Americans were quite concerned after the Gary Powers shooting down by ground missiles, air-to-air. They were worried that maybe the new MiG-21s might just be able to get up to them, but they didn't think they could. And Lightning was the nearest thing they thought. So they did some trials down the North Sea. And yes, of course, the lightning did get up there. Now, it was pretty much ballistic as it went past, but they did go past the U2, and that it was quite easy to see that they possibly could have got a missile solution on the U2. So I think that gave the Americans a great deal of food for thought, and that was the dear old Lightning, wonderful airplane, but very limited on fuel and very limited on weapons. So it's debatable whether you could say it was a great, for its day, it was marvelous to fly. But
I was about to say, but the limitation on fuel and perhaps operational capability absolutely outweighed by the broad smile on the pilot's face.
Absolutely. I mean, as a young man, you know, to be able to do that sort of thing. And I mean, the stories are legion about how you had to be so careful with speed. Bugs Bendel in his book, for those who've read it, I do recommend you read it, but he was doing a display earlier than my days when the RCDS, Royal College of Defence Studies, were doing a visit to Watersham. And he was late in sort of October, very cold day, and they were all arraigned around the outside gallery on the air traffic tower. And Bugs just overstepped the Mach limit and broke and demolished the prefabricated parts of the ops wing and broke a lot of the ATC windows. And in our line book in Treble One, there's this wonderful line where an army colonel is brushing the glass off his greatcoat because he's very gay. Is heard to say, I give these Air Force chappies their due, they spare no expense. Anyway, it was a great airplane. I went back and did the weapons instructor course in 1973, and I was reposted to Treble One, but sadly my first wife died at that time. So the Air Force, God bless it, very thinking organisation, realised that probably I needed a change of scenery rather than going back to Watersham at the time, because my first wife had been one of the accountant officers there. So they posted me to 56 Squadron in Cyprus, which again was a great tour, and it did, you know, I don't know, I'm still only about 26, 27 at that stage. And wonderful, wonderful tour, albeit abbreviated because the government of the day brought us back immediately after the Turkish invasion. But I was lucky enough to be on QRA, or we called it battle flight in Cyprus, and I was luckily to scramble the first scramble to intercept the Turks when they first came over, which was a bit intimidating, in so much as I went on to I jumped into the airplane because the red phone went, and the master controller was saying we've got 6 tracks coming down from Adana, and I thought 6 to 1 is not very good odds, and I was very glad to see Henry Plojek, my flight commander, jumping into the other QRA airplane, so at least there were 2 of us. But actually we were all armed up already, so there were a lot of other pilots running 2 airplanes. So it was a real Battle of Britain type of scramble. We all launched airborne, and I intercepted an RF-84 coming in over the northern Cyprus coast. It was all a bit, our rules of engagement were a bit woolly at the time, I must admit. It was basically, you could shoot if they shot at you, and which I thought was, yeah, okay, fine. And I'd trying to avoid being shot down when he was, anyway, he wasn't in that sort of mode. He was a recce airplane, and the Lightning was actually bigger than the RF-84, dear old RF, smoking like mad, quite an ancient jet even then. And he went round Nicosia a couple of times, and you could see when he was taking photographs because the camera doors on the nose, you could see them literally. So I could tell what he was taking photographs of, which was great, because when I was interrogated later, you know, for the int type of thing, I could tell them that he went round Nicosia, then down the Kyrenia beaches. He then went to Morphu, and I took him as far as Morphu, doing a very close formation on him, close formation escort. And it was most amusing because there's this guy, obviously as nervous as I was, but this mighty lightning sitting there, and he was giving me all of the NATO hand signals for air brakes and things like that. When he wanted to descend, he would give me the NATO signals. So it was a bit surreal, to say the least. And if I can jump forward a few years, Del, and you probably see the end of this story, but I was I think I was a group captain by that time, so it is a few years later, and I was in a NATO conference in Brussels somewhere, or maybe Mons or something, and with lots of different air forces. And we were all talking, I was, you know, all different nations, and talking about the airplanes we've flown. Like all group captains, we wanted to be flying officers again. And we talked about what airplanes, and I by that time I was on Tornadoes, but I'd gone through Lightnings. And I think this Turkish colonel, just 2 or 3 down from me, picked up that I'd been on Lightnings. He said, "Oh, were you ever in Cyprus?" And I said, "Yes, I was in Cyprus." He said, "Ah," and he poked his chest. He said, "I was the first reconnaissance airplane over Cyprus in 1974. And I said, "Yes. And you went round Nicosia twice, you went down the Kyrenia beaches, and then finished up at Morphu." And he said, "You were in the Lightning."
Excellent.
Small world. Small world.
You mentioned about Tornado, and I know we're going to end up skipping a bit here, I'm sure. But
I'm sorry, we're time.
No, absolutely not at all. I know people will be fascinated, but the holding of QRA, you mentioned about holding battle flight in Cyprus for that intercept with the RF-84, and clearly that's something that dominated your career as an air defender. How much of that did you then see more latterly in the Tornado from holding Q, or your team's holding Q?
Well, it was more the Phantom. You know, I'm mindful that we're finishing on the hour, do we?
We will go for as long as people are prepared to listen, I think. So we'll come on to the Battle of Britain stuff in a minute.
I'm free. The wife's gone shopping, so I've got the morning to myself. Thank God. No, I mean, post. I'll just quickly step off this, but post Cyprus, I went back to Watersham with the squadron, and then amazingly was posted to on a short notice posting to Sandhurst as a squadron leader. I was promoted and went to Sandhurst as an instructor on the standard military course. So I had to do the School of Infantry at Warminster. So you're looking at somebody who's a fighter pilot who's done the School of Infantry at Warminster. But I tell you what, there's nothing more dangerous. You think flying jet airplanes is risky. There is nothing more dangerous than taking students through a section attack using live weapons. We use live weapons. Do it through a section attack where they go flanking and all this sort of stuff. I was always convinced that my life was going to be ended by a young cadet with an SLR rather than flying an airplane. Anyway, that was 2.5 years, and I flew there. But I then went on to the Phantom, and that's really where QRA came into it. As much as I ever did QRA was from Lucas. I was back on Treble 1 squadron, and we did a lot of interception of the Bears and the Badgers. You know, QRA was very, very active in those days, very active indeed.
And subsequently onto the Tornado, and I know you took station command over this period as well with the Tornado. How did you find station command, having been a young buck, having, as we've all heard and you've alluded, some considerable experiences as a JO and escalating? But how did you find station command? What challenges did that bring?
Well, it did. I just jumped back a little bit into my Phantom career because after Lucas, I commanded wonderfully. I'm not wonderful. I didn't command it wonderfully. It was a wonderful time. I think it's for others to judge whether it was wonderful or not. But
and there may be people on the call. Forgive me. There may be people on the call that might want to make a judgment there as well. Perhaps we can invite that now.
Yeah, exactly. Particularly if there are some there. I literally had a message from my old ops clerk the other day, who's general manager at Glasgow ATC, I think. Anyway, before I joined as a squadron commander on 74 Squadron at Watersham, flying the F4J Phantom, great airplane. My AOC was an old friend called Ken Hare. He and I have both been display pilots through the years subsequently. And the AOC, I went down as a wing commander to have my do it this way type of interview. And it was, as you would expect, you know, welcome to the force and best of luck and all that sort of stuff. As I was leaving, almost as an afterthought, Ken Hare, I'd saluted and he said, "Oh, Cliff, just one word of advice." And he said, "Protect the Mavericks." And I thought, "Right, sir," saluted and walked out. That became more obvious as the years went on, and I come back to your station command a bit. Having been a rather mousy junior officer, hence my long term as a flight lieutenant, I did have, I thought, and I know a lot of the youngsters had their best interests of their squadron and the tactics, and sometimes they didn't always sort of put it forward tactfully, and say, you know, because they were all fired up about something, and they could be a bit maverick, but they were the guys who were going to win wars, and I could understand what Ken meant then. And so both as a squadron commander and when I became station commander at Coningsby, and just prior to that I'd been in the Falklands as station commander, it was very easy to see these guys who were bubbling with enthusiasm. They couldn't always keep their mouths shut, rightly so, and they didn't always do it, shall we say, the most tactful way, but they did need protecting sometimes, because there were indeed some, shall we say, senior officers who didn't take to the chest poking quite so much. So you had to ride that and try and make sure you brought those young men on so that you could garner the best from them, because they were the war winners, there's no doubt about it. Anyway, being a station commander was great, and of course that was my introduction to the old airplanes as well. Did
you recognise yourself, and again, probably a difficult one to answer, but recognise yourself when Ken Hare said, you know, protect the Mavericks? Did you recognise in your junior officers at that stage something in yourself?
Yeah, I think I probably did. I think we all do. It's sometimes. I always used to say to young pilot, look, the best the best person to criticize your performance is yourself. And I said, and the best medium for that is looking in the mirror and saying, don't delude yourself. I didn't do that right, or did this right, and I need to do that. And trying to be self-critical, or trying to instill a level of self-criticism. And so you get an environment where people can be open about when they've made a mistake and not fear that they're going to get a sword over their head. People do make mistakes. I mean, I've made plenty. And they've got to be able to learn from those mistakes. I mean, sometimes, obviously, if it's from a, shall we say, a continual progress of not doing it right, then you have to look at the motor skills and things like that, or if they're really over the top and disruptive. But if you're self-critical, I think that's the best thing you can ever achieve, being an aviator. But anyway, yes, back to Coningsby.
Yeah, and I guess that self-critique and that ability to look at yourself and say, I didn't do that well, perhaps does bring us neatly on to going into the historic aircraft circuit, which you allude to the fact you picked up when you were the station commander at Coningsby, from what I can gather.
Yeah, I mean, hey, you're so lucky to get a station in the Royal Air Force. to get to Mount Pleasant and then Coningsby just was double the strawberries, as they say. But even if I can't keep this metaphor going, the cream on the top, well, it should be the cherry on the top, shouldn't it? But was the fact I got Coningsby with BBMF as well. So I'd obviously, my prayer mat had worked, obviously, and I was able to fly these aeroplanes, which right from when I was a young lad, I'd heard about and knew about, and now I had the chance to fly.
And the years that have followed, you've spent, I think, just about every year since that time on the display circuit. Perhaps you can, and seriously take as long as you like. Let's talk about your experiences flying those lovely aircraft.
Well, Coningsby, obviously, we flew first of all the Hurricane for 15 hours. That was, I mean, my first trip ever in a Hurricane. You know, I remember taxiing out. You did there's no two-seaters, of course, even though we did a couple of Harvard rides. And I always remember that Paul Day, who was the fighter leader in the BBMF in those days, squadron leader Paul Day, I always remember him saying, giving me the full brief and all that. And it was very, very good, very good. But one thing he hadn't mentioned was the noise. And I always remember taxiing out in the Hurricane thinking, my God, I'm not sure this is right. I think the engine's falling apart, because it sounds like a 1,000 guardsmen marching along on a tin tray. And I was waiting for ground crew to give me the wave off and stop, because I'm sure. But they didn't. They were all just waving at me, and there's a station commander off to be dangerous. And so it was very noisy, and it's very hot, and very exciting. So 15 hours in the Hurricane was a delight. And then you graduated to the Spitfire. My first ride in the Spitfire was in peace. In fact, my watch, I was presented with a watch that was engraved with the first Spitfire I ever flew, but P7350, the only surviving Battle of Britain Mark II aircraft that's around, only surviving Spitfire that flew in the Battle of Britain. Why they gave it to me to fly on my first solo. Anyway, I did. And there's no doubt about it. You might fly in a lot of very expensive airplanes in the Royal Air Force that the Queen gives you to fly. But there's none more intimidating than going out in what is a piece of national heritage. So, yeah, I flew the Spitfire, and having told my wife that this is only for 2 years while I'm station commander here at Coningsby, and, you know, I'm sorry about the loss of weekends and stuff like that. But, you know, 2 years, as she said, you know, 30 years later, that excuse was beginning to wear a bit thin. So it just happened that I was doing a display in a Mark 19 Spitfire down at Mildenhall, and I met Ray Hanna, who I'd known, who used to lead the Red Arrows. His son, Mark, had been on my flight at Lucas on the Phantom, and actually had been at Watersham on the simulator when I was squadron commander. So I knew the family. And he was there doing a display, and I went over and said, sitting on the grass. And he said, look, when you finish with BBMF, he said, would you like to come and fly with the old flying machine company? So being a man who couldn't say no, I said yes. And the rest is history. I've flown with other historic companies, but during my remainder of my service career, whenever I could find the time, I carried on flying, and so I flew them every year up until last year.
And has the domestic understanding of this protracted, only 2-year period been accepted?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of people watching who've had to do lots of time away from families in the RAF, so they will know that it's never always easy sailing. I think Caroline became to understand that it was really part of my soul, and that I was frankly a pain in the backside when I wasn't flying. So this year has been interesting.
Yeah. When was the last time that you managed to get airborne?
Well, it was literally on my last. I decided last year, with the advancing years, that it was probably time to hang up my my display gloves. I still intend to fly, and in fact, I was supposed to be flying in the last 2 or 3 weeks, but again, the ebb and flow of COVID-19 has rather restricted that. I flew last September. My swan song was at the last air show at Duxford, and I led a formation of 15 Spitfires, then a 9 ship, and then an old friend who was organising the show let me do the solo. I peeled off and did this solo as my final display, and then after I landed, I was very gratifyingly met by all the pilots and my family and my grandsons who were all dancing around, and given a bit of a champagne reception all rather emotional.
That's I can only imagine, but a wonderful way to finish your display career at Duxford and taking the solo. Must have been highly emotional.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I mean, people have said, why do you do it? You're still, seem to be in the groove, and of course there is that tendency to think, yeah, I'm still in the groove. But I do think, going back to my look in the mirror bit, as I said to somebody, a 74-year-old pilot and a 76-year-old airplane, what could possibly go wrong?
Nice 150-year combination. They're asking for trouble, perhaps.
I think you are. I think you have to accept Anna Domini at some stage. I'm touching wood of my desk as I say this. I do still intend to fly, and I think as long as you, again, genuine about your medical fitness and your abilities and all the rest of it, and don't put mistakes down, just put them aside. Oh, well, that doesn't matter. You've got to be very analytical about your flying. I always smile when I tell that story about, I may have the name wrong, I think it was Daddy Probert, who was an Air Commodore who retired in Kenya. He built his own airplane at the age of 70, and he used to fly in Kenya down to what was the Wilson Airport at Nairobi, which was the local little smaller airport. And Daddy built this single-seat airplane, which he used to fly down from up country and to Wilson and go to his club, very colonial. And at the age of 90, excuse me, they fitted radios at Wilson, and they had to have a radio. So Daddy used to say, well, what's a radio for, sort of thing. And so he just used to press the button as he arrived at Wilson and just say, Daddy arriving. So everybody got out of his way. But I mean, he used to fly the airplane very well. Then one day he got down to the club, and I think this story is fairly well known. And it had literally a key to start the thing, which it put into the mag switch. And he just put the key on the coffee bar desk in the flying club and said, there's my airplane. Can someone give me a lift back to my strip? And they said, well, he's 90 by this time. And he said, why? He said, it's time to give it up. He said, I got my fuel planning all wrong coming down here. And he just thought to himself, and he was 90. And he went on to almost his century anyway. And he was a very live and wise old chap, but he just decided, I got that wrong at the time I gave it up. Anyway, it's a very long story.
That good sense of judgment, I guess.
Yes, it is. Yes.
If I may, I'd like to come back to Pilbara with the Battle of Britain anniversary as we are, and I don't know exactly. Forgive me, how many hours you have flying the Battle of Britain aircraft as a whole, but a considerable number, I would imagine. And many people will be aware you served as AOC 1118 Group, direct link back to Battle of Britain. You phoned the Battle of Britain aircraft. What has all that given you, with a very protracted career in that environment, in the way of association with the people who actually flew in the Battle of Britain? By way of understanding, I think you have a unique perspective.
I mean, one of the joys of flying these airplanes, and I can again refer to Andrew, who is in part of the audience here. He's grinning there because when I was at AOC 1118 group, I effectively had two headquarters. They joined the two groups. That in itself is another story, which I don't think we've got time for today. But I was well blessed with two outstanding Air Commodores, and I'm making Andrew blush, I'm sure. But he effectively was over at Northwood as my one-star on the 18 group and the maritime side, and I had Lloyd Doble, who was in what I call the 11 group side at Bentley Priory. So I had two officers. So God bless them. They manned the ship while I was out with the boys flying Nimrods or Tornadoes, whatever else. And probably Andrew would say that was more often than not. But one of the great joys was, particularly as AOC, every year we used to have the Battle of Britain Aircrew Association had their annual dinner at Bentley Priory. And I'd met a lot of these pilots flying these old airplanes at various air shows. And I was always immensely impressed with these modest men who'd done such outstanding things. And they really were genuinely modest. There were people there who had bailed out, escaped, got back through Spain, and 3 months later they were back in the fight. I mean, it was quite incredible. But there were, sad stories as well. But meeting these people and seeing them was such an enormous privilege. And I always remember I used to sit next to, anyway, I'll think of it in a second. Sitting next to the chairman and, sorry, I'm going name blind, but it doesn't matter. Sitting next to the chairman and at these dinners, and he looked and he was musing and looking out at these guys who were swapping stories and drinking wine and having generally a good time. He said, they really are an outstanding bunch, aren't they? And I had to agree with him. That was Air Marshal Foxley Norris, Sir Christopher Norris. And I was lucky enough over the years to meet these people who would tell you their little personal stories because you were flying the Spitfire, stories which probably they normally weren't disposed to do. It's very difficult to drag stories out of them. And I even on the other side, the Luftwaffe pilots, because I not only flew the Spitfire and the Hurricane and Mustang and all American fighters, which I was lucky to fly. I met a lot of the American pilots, who flew the Corsair and the P-47 Thunderbolt. What an airplane that is. But I also met a lot of the Luftwaffe pilots when I was flying the Messerschmitt. In fact, I met one in Augsburg going from Switzerland to Warsaw in a Messerschmitt. That's a story in itself. But they were different, but they all had that same sort of persona, modest about their achievements. And in very gritty days, we forget that although we wrap it up with a lot of glamour, it was hugely tiring. They will all admit to being very scared and very tired as well. I mean, the story of the ground crew, the pilots of landing, and one Spitfire, still with its engine just ticking over at the end of the landing roll, was stopped at the end of the airfield. So they got into some vehicle and drove off to this airplane, and the pilot was sitting in the cockpit asleep. And landed and got to the end of the runway. The airplane was stopped, just ticking over. Pilot had just gone to sleep. So it brought it back, and flying the airplanes, the Spitfire is just stunning to fly. It is. I'm often asked about my flying career. I'm lucky enough to have flown all the remaining flying marks of Spitfire and all the American airplanes, and of course all operational airplanes that I so enjoy. And again, in deference to Andrew, who was saying, only large aeroplane I ever qualified on was a Nimrod. And what a stunning aeroplane that was as well. But anyway, sorry.
I was going to say, interestingly, Cliff, Andrew's actually sent a message in, and as his words will echo, I think, what everybody's thinking, just a fascinating session. And it's not come to an end yet, but a fascinating session. Thank you. What Andrew has put is, your natural love of flying is dominated by fighters, but you've also flown some very different types. For example, your hours on Nimrods as our AOC. So there's obviously a plug for the Nimrod there. But Andrew's question, and quite rightly, Andrew's question, did you learn any lessons from non-fighter aircraft that you have flown?
Yeah, well, I'm glad.
Great question.
I'm glad Andrew's raised that, because when I'd been SASO of 11 Group and went over to Chief of Staff of 18 Group. I couldn't understand why. I'm sure 18 Group couldn't understand why either, but I went over as the one-star Chief of Staff. It all became clear later, of course. But I went over, and subsequently I went to Kinloss and qualified on the Nimrod, and quite properly. There were no prisoners. They were going to qualify me, and I went through the simulator and went through the full rigmarole, day, night flying, operational type flying. I have to say I was singularly impressed. As somebody who had been, you tend to get into your own particular era and think that is it. And you don't come out of it probably enough. The Nimrod and the crews associated with it were so professional. They were so professional. And this was not for the weak-hearted either. Flying, I always remember coming down on a tactical descent, having dropped sonar buoys and things, and doing a tactical descent to literally engage with the submarine, and coming down through cloud in a big aeroplane with the VSI off the clock. And I always remember coming down, so shall we say 4,000 feet? I don't know what height it was, but anyway, it was still coming down. And I was thinking, I think about time I started to get this thing leveled off a little bit. And my instructor, so my instructor in the right-hand seat, I was always flying in the left-hand seat, said, "Come on, sir, keep it coming down." I was thinking, wow. Anyway, so you really did come down. And so the flying involved was very, very sharp. And also with a big aeroplane, and I know Nimrod, there are bigger airplanes than the Nimrod, but to me, the Nimrod was a big airplane. And when you're at low level over the sea, and then putting a 45, it sounds not a lot, does it? 45-degree back down and 60 degrees at 250 feet and 500 feet, depending on how much. You really felt very adjacent to the water, and you really did have to think about your flying. And these guys were past masters at it. More than that, excuse me, the crew, the navigators, because sometimes it wasn't the pilot who were captains, a navigator, captain, taking tactical control of the airplane, and the team, wet or dry teams, the people who were interrogating the various systems in the back of the airplane, were so professional, and they're so good at what they were doing. I know I'm biased because I'm Royal Air Force, but I do think the Nimrod and the work and the crews were the topping out the best in the world in maritime terms. And I was devastated when we got rid of the force. I know there were lots of other reasons around that. For lots of reasons we probably can't discuss here today. But yeah, I'm sorry, I seem to be overly effusive, but when you're taken out and you actually suddenly realize that the Royal Air Force is the sum of its parts. We all get into our little arena and we think the best, and we are Harriers or Lightnings or Phantoms, or I was flying this and that. But to realize that, I realized then, and perhaps I should have realized a lot easier, just exactly across the board what a professional outfit it was. So yeah, I love my time on the Nimrod, and it was grand. They put me. It was a no prisoners. I always remember coming back from, I think it was my handover trip to from Wynne Harris. Sadly recently died, and he decided he was going to do all the flying down in the south near Florida, and I was going to do it all in the north. Oh, thanks very much. And I always remember going into Halifax on our return trip, and that was an interesting approach, but there was no question about me not being put through it. And I put it on the ground, and on a very wet and windy day in Halifax. And I thought to myself, well, the training in this outfit is pretty good. Anyway, so I'm probably gone on, I don't mean to go on too long, but in that, but those airplanes and flying the Hercules down in the South Atlantic with the Hercules cruise. Equally, when I was sitting in the left-hand seat and we were going out in the fishing, and I was flying it out with doing the fishing interrogation boats. What a great bunch and highly professional tanker crews who dragged me around the world and giving you more fuel than they probably should have done, and putting themselves in a position where they had to get to the nearest airfield, but they did it to keep errant fighter pilots like me in the air and back to their base. So there's so many different parts in the aviation world which I have a reason to be thankful for, and I'm very glad I've been part of the organisation for it. Yeah.
And I'm sure the organisation would reflect that right back at you. I mean, you have flown so many aircraft. I'm going to ask you a very unfair question now. I'm going to warm you up to a question that you probably know is going to come then. So you mentioned from the Chipmunk through to the last aircraft you mentioned was the Hercules, and lots of fast jets and historic aircraft in the middle. If you could pick only one, and you can pick only one, which aircraft would be the one that you would say has put the biggest smile on your face, the one that you've enjoyed flying the most? Very unfair question. Forgive me before you answer, but let's see if we can pin you down.
Well, I will think about it, because I was asked this for a recent book I did a little chapter for, and it is a very difficult question, because time and place. Who wouldn't be wished to, as a young man, to be launching in a Lightning and roaring along, or the mighty Phantom, which was probably time for time, the best and most effective aeroplane I ever flew operation. No, I'm talking fighter airplanes now. On the historic side, I mean, I'm lucky, and I suppose I think I've flown about 65 types and marks, not just types, but types and marks of aeroplane. And so, I don't know, I put it this way, that snarling along on the warbird side in a Sea Fury, oh wow, behind a 2,500 horsepower Centaurus, talk about hair on the back of your neck coming up, amazing. And then of course the Battle of Britain type aeroplanes like the Spitfire and the Hurricane. So I'll answer your question this way, and the way I normally do it. If God said, he might do this, if God said to me, you can fly one more trip in any airplane or mark you've ever flown, one more trip, that's your last one, what would you fly? Well, it would be the Spitfire. I don't know whether that's because of its historical connotations or the fact I've flown it over the last 30 years on and off. But it is an aeroplane, when you get into it, you feel the history, flies beautifully. It's a close run thing, I might say. It's a close run thing, but I think probably...
It's a very unfair question for me to have asked you, but I'm sure you're not surprised that I asked it. And it's, I think beautifully answered. Now, my next question is more of a personal one, really, I guess. But you have so much to tell, and we can't do it justice in an hour and a bit on a lovely Friday, September morning. But very fitting, as I say, just to echo again, very fitting that you joined us for what is actually our last session in this format. And an absolute honour to be talking to you about it. But my question is, when are you going to write all of this down and publish a book?
Well, have you been talking to my son? I mean,
no, I promise I haven't. There's no conspiracy.
My son and daughter, I mean, more of a journal for maybe the grandchildren and so, things like that. I started. I actually have started. Yeah, I've been pressed to do it, and as I say, I think we're all the same. It doesn't matter where you've been, what you've done. We've all got a story to tell, and it'd be nice to sort of try and capture some of this. I look over my shoulder, and I got 4 RAF logbooks up there, flying logbooks, and I keep looking through them and think, oh God, I'd forgotten that some particular hairy day or and story that suddenly jumps out of the pages at me, and I think, oh, and it takes me back. So I am going to write it down, and I'll stop writing forwards for other people's books and write my own, I think. But it is the people. I mean, it sounds like it's a bit trite, but I don't mean it to be like that. It is the people that have made that. Even though the flying has been, to me, has been stunning. I've loved every minute of it, and I'd start again tomorrow, as we all probably would. But the people involved have just been just fantastic. There's been some wonderful stories. I can think of a whole raft of them, but whether it was my juniors when I was a senior officer or when I was a junior officer, we talked about engineering earlier on, whether I would ever have made an engineer. My first squadron, lessons learned, still probably pushing the margins a bit, excuse me. I overstressed a lightning, I over-G'd it. Not by a great deal, but I did. And in the lightning, and if there are any lightning engineers in our audience, they'll be nodding their heads and saying bloody pilots. Yeah, but if you did, you had to drop the bottom engine in the lightning and look at some of the bearers to make sure there were no cracks. So it was, if you over-G'd, the airplane came out of the line, dropped the engine, etc. Well, I'd just been on a sortie on a Monday morning, and I overstressed, over-enthusiasm and lack of ability. And I came back in, and I was having my leg pulled in the crew room by one of the other junior pilots, so I was having a bit of a wry grin. I wasn't laughing that I'd done it, but at what he'd just said to me. Unfortunately, the boss came into the crew room at the same time and saw me smiling. I should have actually been in sackcloth and ashes, as you know, but my boss, who was a wonderful squadron commander called Peter Collins, said, "You think it's funny, do you, Cliff?" And I said, "Well, no, sir, I don't. No, nor do I." And he had in his hand a pair of airman's overalls. He said, "Put those on." He said, "Go out to the hangar." And he said, "Help the engineers change the engine or look at the engine." So from Monday afternoon until I think it was Friday morning, I was just spanner handling for taking this engine out, which was a big thing for me. I was missing all this flying. All my mates were flying and I wasn't. But the engineers were brilliant. They didn't take advantage of the fact I was there. But nonetheless, I was changing this engine, and eventually feeling pretty sorry for myself on the Friday morning it was out on the line. The boss came through, and because we hadn't disturbed any of the flying controls, it didn't need an air test as such. Anybody could fly. And he came in and he said, "Okay, go and fly it now and don't do it again." What a lesson, and not only that, it was a lesson for everybody. And one, incidentally, that I used when I was a squadron commander. with one of my young pilots who was a bit over enthusiastic and didn't really seem to. I got him working on the airplanes for a couple of days, and it's a lesson well learned. Sorry, I don't know how we got into that one, but
I think that's a lovely story on how you start right at the beginning of your career in the service from an engineering perspective, and whilst clearly not at the end of your career, that the tale of actually helping to service the aircraft. But then one could argue, and I'm not an engineer, but you did break it, so I can just imagine the engineers saying, "Well, what more do you expect?"
Yeah, exactly. And the dear old engineers, and I said earlier about how wonderful that everybody was in supporting what we were doing ostensibly at the sharp end. But I think back to the above the call, really, what the engineers used to do sometimes when we were trying to generate aeroplanes. It was so wonderful that the amount of effort some of them used to put in, and so particularly when you were short of trades. I had a corporal electrician when I was squadron commander, and I was very short of electricians. Isn't it ironic that I started off as an air electrician? But I found him at for some reason or other, we were on alert for a tachyval or something, but I had occasion to go over the squadron around about midnight or 2 o'clock in the morning, where we weren't supposed to be flying with. And there was this corporal with one other chap still working. I said, "You were on the day shift?" And he said, "Yes, sir, but we had to get this airplane out, so I came back in after my tea." Yeah, it was really, really sort of wonderful the way the sort of level of not just professionalism, but the level of commitment that you got from people, which was just stunning. It was stunning.
I think, regrettably, and great to know that the book is coming, I think regrettably we probably are going to need to pull stumps. And I could talk all day, Cliff, and I'm so grateful for you joining us. Just to reiterate, as the last guest in this format, we've been doing this since March during the lockdown period, and I have to say it's an absolute privilege, sir. Thank you to talk to you during Battle of Britain week over such important topics. So on behalf of everybody, if I may, thank you very much for joining us, and please let us know when the book comes out.
I will. And can I say, Dale, just before I go, I mean, there are lots of stories which I'd love to talk about, Gulf War and all those sort of things. But if I could just say to the people who are watching, who I've met and probably work with, it's wonderful to see so many names and come up. And maybe on a different day we can all share a conversation. That's for sure. But it's been very, very good to be able to talk to everybody.
It's been our absolute pleasure. I know that the comments that will come in directly into Amy that people will have enjoyed it. Now it is tradition. I don't know whether you've got any tea or coffee left. I'm not sure whether you've had an opportunity to take a sup actually, but I will raise my association mug to you, sir. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
And as I say, please do let us know when that book comes out. But on behalf of everybody, Air Marshal Cliff Spink, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you all again next time. Thank you. Thank you.